Welcome, everybody, to the nationwide prayer campaign to end abortion forever. This is the most important part of the whole entire hour, our prayer to the Lord. And it's the 3 o'clock hour from which He died, and the heavens are opened up for us. So we just ask with all our hearts, pray with all our hearts, and we just really concentrate that this should end the death of innocent babies in the womb as Jesus wants. Thank you. Let's get started.
No problem. It's my pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, John Lee. Uh, we're here to discuss abortion in healthcare as a public health event, and also a very personal and also spiritual action with consequences. So we will use 5 cases to illustrate some points, and I will discuss certain implications or policy issues. So we will subdivide like 2.5 cases today and the rest tomorrow. And I will just describe what those cases are so you will get a brief idea already. The first situation is a 47-year-old white female who is homeless and is on drugs. The other case is a depressed and anxious 70-year-old white male. And the third is a 50-year-old Asian female, actually a Filipina nurse, secondarily infertile, and with breast CA. So I will stop at the infertile part, and I will just go in some detail to the cases, and then I will bring kind of a global public health awareness to the problem, and then tomorrow we will drill down on the issues. I'll just read the last two so you'll get a flavor of the effects on a woman. Blood clot in a 25-year-old diabetic and obese black female. And this is just emphasizing too that, abortion may seemingly be surgical for the most part, but there is also an aspect of abortion that is happening when one uses contraceptives simply because their own therapeutic or pharmacopoeic formulary description includes that as their mechanism of action, that of the anti-implantation effect, which basically is when you already have an ovum or a formed person, it will not have that capacity to implant in the uterus, and therefore will have no choice but to miscarry, and therefore contraception is really abortion in its most mechanisms, especially birth control pills. And the last one is a 30-year-old Hispanic female with sepsis and DIC, is disseminated intravascular coagulation after retained products of conception. It should have been POC. So these are people that I have known in the community. I've aided in some clinics, and some I have gotten referrals in my forensic practice. I'm a forensic pathologist or a medical examiner. I also am a public health scientist. So these are anonymized, as you could imagine. So let's first share about the 47-year-old white homeless female. So she came in with a complaint of a burnt finger. She had been using heroin and was burning it, and incurred a burnt and infected finger. And on storytelling and narration of her personal social history, she disclosed that she has been experiencing months of homelessness, but she doesn't want to receive help. She doesn't want to get out of her drug seeking lifestyle, which consisted of heroin occasionally and marijuana more frequently. She also said that she had 3 abortions in the past. She has 1 adult son, and she occasionally has him as an emotional support. But she basically had gone into homelessness because she cannot anymore maintain employment, and her anxiety, as well as her increasingly erratic judgment and hallucinations, have gotten better of her. And added to that is the addiction, which depletes her small income. So what had happened in the course was she basically had the wounds that led her to be very vulnerable in terms of the social aspects. And yet she doesn't have anymore that judgment that she needed help and could be helped. She was staying in the transportation center and just getting by really day-to-day existence, begging. But in her heart, when she shares her story, she is forthcoming with her abortion. What I had noted in people who are homeless and perhaps have this prior trauma is that they don't have any embarrassment to disclose their past. It's almost like they're really admitting to that reality, and hopefully, maybe subconsciously, obtain help from it for it. I have had the chance to minister to a homeless person because she was so disheveled and really sitting on the sidewalk, and I tried to just offer her some food. And the first sentences that she started saying to me was, "So many dead babies, so many dead babies." It's like they're in jars, they're all over the walls, they're like babies looking at you. It's nonstop, really, barrage of this imagery and this theme. And when you try to get something in conversation, she would actually like tell details, in Elizabeth or in New Jersey, and these people didn't want it, didn't want me to live, they hated the child, this bits and pieces of this information. And 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 here she is, very um psychotic now, very much in need of all the services possible. But it was abortion at the core, which is hurting this woman. And I just reference it with another case because it was known in our community that the older people living in our town was saying, this woman who is seen often in the streets walking back and forth, she actually had been um, victim of a cult. She was, as a child, taken into a satanic cult, and they did bad things to her. So that was told to me by a friend. And this same friend says, every 5 a.m. in the morning, without fail, this woman would be outside our building and would be screaming the loudest scream that you could ever hear. And it is like that day after day after day. And so when I got to ask her, what do you know about, her period during the satanic cult? And she said, my dad seems to have said to me before that, in the cult, they possibly had abused her and maybe gotten her pregnant, and the baby that was hers, they used for something terrible. And perhaps knowing what I know, in trauma and in post-traumatic episodes, seeing somebody that you love get hurt actually imposes a harder impact on yourself. It actually gives worse effects to the person observing out of love. Now, I'll give a very concrete example. Remember when there was a video of Beyonce and Jay-Z in an elevator, and there was somebody hurting and kicking Jay-Z, and it turned out to be Beyonce's sister, Solange. And what had happened afterwards was it was disclosed that Jay-Z may have had like an affair. And it was because the love of Solange for her sister that led her rage so much at the offender. And Beyonce was just like still. She was like really like steady and just observing the fight of the sister and Jay-Z. And she was not doing anything to control them because it was like a real expression of her sister's anger. But that is how perhaps a woman who is ultimately deprived of the life of her baby, whether or not, she acknowledges that she loves the child there and then, at the time of the abortion, she will have that emotional response that something precious was taken away from her. And boy, in the words of somebody who is post-abortive, after an abortion, she said, "Where is all this rage coming from?" So it is in this rage and anger and total feeling of violation, that many women who maybe hours even or minutes when they have finished their anesthesia have come to realize that something was murdered in me, as well as, the child itself. So this mental anguish, this mental hit is something that we know in the trauma community have had numerous expressions. And later on in the slides, I will allude to that. But essentially, what had happened is that you now react very much like you are really a victim of a great assault. You are very touchy, you are hypervigilant, you are anxious, you're constantly looking over your shoulder, you are agitated, you have sleeplessness, insomnia, and all these sort of experiences gather together and make one react towards a coping mechanism. And sadly, those coping mechanisms are not the healthiest coping mechanisms. They run from excessive sexual behavior or promiscuity, which leads to ultimately repeat abortions. And there are actually abortion addicts that have been documented in the literature. Some of them become taken into addiction like drinking or alcohol or drugs, or just injurious behavior like cutting or mutilating or overeating or other behaviors that are subtler like speeding or just risk-taking in general, absenteeism. They don't care anymore if they will go and have a job, or they don't care anymore if they rage at their husband or parent or teacher. And those are expressions of someone very hurt and very wounded. Now, it has become commonplace in the medical world to see these patients. And it has become very challenging also for the healthcare professionals, so much so that a nurse developed something of a philosophy called trauma-centered care. And it basically defines or reminds others in the profession that many of the patients that you may be caring will have a sort of aberrant and very sensitive and very defensive response. And so you don't take it too personally. You know, they will resist you or reject you or be defiant of you. But that was because they have been from a place of hurt. She didn't really specify abortion, but you know that a lot more people are actually reacting this way. They're actually very resistant to advice or anything that seems intrusive. They want to stay their course no matter how destructive it is. They actually have behaviors that seems to be very conflict laden, like people who are very fighty and always incurring arguments, even in social media. Like Jamila Jamil is one of them. She is actually known to be post-abortive. Some manifestations also seem to be very pro-social, like Madonna adopting children, even though they have their own parents. This, according to a post-abortive woman in a conference, is also an indication of a post-abortive syndrome. This need to have tons of children, whether adoptive or biological. It seems subtler than those that are really acting out, really desperate or drug using or getting into drunken vehicular accidents like Miley Cyrus, perhaps even Marilyn Monroe having pills and unable to sleep and in cycle of marriages that are sometimes abusive. These are post-abortive women, according to that lecturer, and then you can just have a light bulb light on you. Most of the Hollywood women are expressing the same behaviors. They're almost like serially, and as a community, acting out, defying what is, commonly decent. Recently, Chelsea Handler was just putting out her nude pictures out there, and that's how she coped with the pandemic, according to her. But all these, inappropriate responses and expressions in people are really related when you look at their history, that they have a prior abortion. So in my example of this white lady in the first case, she's had 3 abortions. And in other studies that I will go into detail tomorrow, the effects on a post-abortive women follows what is called a dose-response curve. It is proportional to the amount of abortions that one has had. And I know that some of my friends who are post-abortive have shown me this example. They have higher challenges. They have the need for higher healing. Of course, when they are healed, it's almost like it's really new. It's like the parable of those who are workers in the vineyard. Even though they arrived at the last hour, they still get the same benefits. So I just premise it out there that even though the studies express, and we can go to the next slide, that there are a dose response mechanism to those who are post-abort. They do have a higher rate in natural deaths, in accidental deaths, in suicidal and homicidal deaths because they had that bad coping mechanisms and mental illness that had predisposed them to these mostly unnatural causes of death. And in the studies that I will show tomorrow in graph form, these changes occur even at year one post-abortion. They already have like a threefold increase compared to the woman who kept their pregnancy to term. So as I said, my friend who has this expression of homelessness and drug use need at the core of her, because it started before her mental illness. The abortion was decades before. The PTSD that had led her to have these behaviors was simply because the abortion trauma itself was unaddressed, which makes us highlight that for her, who is Catholic, she can use all the available resources at her behest: the sacrament of reconciliation, the Eucharist, the spiritual direction, prayer, and just having a community that will support her. We encourage her to do that sacramental journey again, and thankfully, she is actually in the process of healing. She may not be 100% lucid, but she's receiving the sacraments. And even though they seem to be very incapable of comprehending, one can try to the very best to communicate the reality of this, and if it's sacramentally or religiously appropriate, have them talk to a priest and have them receive that healing and forgiveness, because that will just set them off in a totally different direction. It's almost similar to when we have given antipsychotic medications to those who are just totally crazy. I couldn't recognize them the next month because they're so lucid. Hi, Dr. Amala. Like, they're so together. So it's the same, they have this spiritual pills and counseling and advice that has been proven by those who have gone through these retreats: Lumina, Rachel's Vineyard, Project Rachel, or other programs run by the Priest for Life, or any diocesan pro-life program, Sisters for Life. It's something that will set them away from the direction where they will be just in self-destruction mode. They actually will have the chance to live out in a charism that they are meant to be, which is to glorify God. I just insert this with a little story, and we can continue to the third slide. When I was in med school, I was into writing. And I wanted to produce, that great Filipino or American or film screenwriting. So I wanted to attend a screenwriter's workshop. It was run by the best writer, Ricky Lee, and I applied and I was accepted. The requirement of the workshop was I have to give a treatment, a film treatment, which is a breakdown, total detail of the step-by-steps down through the narrative arc. And when the class started, of all the people in this very competitive class, I raised my hand when he asked for a volunteer to describe the film treatment. And my film treatment was a pro-abort film. I was not in the Lord then, And so, being in sin and being in confusion, my film treatment was actually for the promotion of abortion. So it actually ended up with the image of a very disheveled woman, not too different from those that I minister to now, very naked and attached to their female genital system via a umbilical cord was a fetus that she herself had aborted. So I thought that it was such like a great finale. And when the class didn't end in applause, Ricky Lee said to us, "Who the heck would want to watch that movie? It's depressing." And little Miss Diva me was just taken aback. And I had a pause. My liberal progressive side had a deep pause. And I just looked back and said, he is so right. There is, as I would learn later, 4 times more energy to address hate and be hateful than it is to love. Love is almost effortless. So if I had become rather more pure in mind and spirit and body, become more focused in loving God, I would have really an easier time. I would have no drama, no conflict, no defensive posture against the many positions that I've held because I believed in reproductive rights. But it was at the core of it was really a lack of submission and a lack of humility to what the church teaches. And so I was grateful that from the previous slide I had mentioned that I saw a Danish study where abortion users had 4 to 6 times more deaths than those that had carried their babies to term, because that was a study that I discovered preparing for a lecture when I was already a practicing medical examiner, lecturing on maternal health, that I came to see, wow, if this is the outcome on women, it's terrible. And therefore, I now believe why the church prohibits abortion. It was like that. It was a snap that made it now like bright as day to me that abortion is wrong. So that now in this series where the number one killer in the Black community is being described, having studied all these other deaths before it, HIV deaths, which you can prevent by abstinence, you now have a different frame, right, on how to prevent it. Firearm death, which can be prevented by laws, curtailing the distribution and access to firearms, and also human kindness. Diabetes, good diet and exercise. Accidental deaths, just prevention of falls, prevention of pool access to kids, observance to those who are speeding, ticketing them and all. Cancer deaths, of course, doing no smoking and no drinking to excess. Heart disease, the same thing. But the highest cause of death in this population, which is the Black community here, is abortion. And even CDC captures this. This data is either from CDC or Guttmacher Foundation, which was the Planned Parenthood research arm. They make it easy for us to see what they're doing because they get the research disclosed from that. But what to me shows is that abortion is a public health problem. I didn't even know until I was doing my own master's in public health in violence prevention that the World Health Organization classification of injury has abortion defined as infanticide. It's really in that category, no question. It's political that there are other agencies like the UNFPA adopt a very pro-abort and pro-contraceptive stance. But at the heart of this, you see that if the Black community is incurring annual deaths of 300,000, and the total abortion from 1.6 million is now 900,000, meaning 1/3 of all the US deaths in the general statistics calculation. That is really significant genocide. And I just leave it out there that many people are saying, reproductive health or pro-choice should be the way to go. It actually favors the woman, favors the family. But we've already seen that the post-traumatic death or post-traumatic effects on a woman that is post-abortive translates to higher deaths in the community. So the babies that are killed in this graph actually translates to so much deaths of mothers. So that's for the first case. The second case is a 70-year-old white male that was anxious and depressed. Now, this male was depressed because of a recent health insult. Males are very much dependent on two things: their emotional health or social health, which is premised on having a married status, because marriage promotes this health, especially physical health in a man, and that the man is physically healthy, which is interesting because it builds also on a marital health in a sense, if you're married. But a man who had a challenge in the health department almost challenges him doubly because his identity is that of a provider and a protector. So to have that physical health challenged through perhaps cancer or heart attack, which are quite common, or even just the threat of it, right? Or even just a diagnosis of it, yet you have years and years to live. It rankles them far more and really disrupts their kind of equilibrium. So what had happened to this male was he had moved into a distress. And when you ask him, he would come to disclose other things that have led him to feel distress, including that of the past. He had said, I had aborted my second child. I thought one was just enough. I don't want any more children, which will just perhaps bring to more children, and I'm not ready to provide it. Like, ironically, as I said, it's more energy it takes to backtrack on your mission, which is really to love. This man backtracked on his mission to provide. And that just led him to just make decisions after poor decisions. And ultimately now, at the near end of his life, was suffering mentally. Because if he were to die, he would have to answer for this poor decision of his. Thankfully, he was able to reach out and know about these other retreat centers and healing opportunities through the charismatic renewal. And he was very, very grateful. He was brought also to a community of encouragement and life giving, and, you know, not to look back on the past, not to let it really be that millstone. So what had happened to him was he now had begun to heal. He's like an active minister in the church. He's super prayerful to all those who witness or express like a challenge in their life, mental, spiritual, however. He's like one of the biggest prayer warriors I know. And he speaks of his repentance so vividly and so much joyfully. Like his tears would like just flow. And this was already 10 years after his healing, right? He would still praise the Lord and just thank Him nonstop. Almost like the divine mercy image was just like splattered on his soul. Like God's mercy was just super strong in his background, that he can now just know and say to everyone, just turn to the Lord, because no sin is bigger than God. No sin is bigger than God. So what I want to have a take home from his example is that the man also had post-abortion stress syndrome, but he was the man. He was not the woman. The effect on him was also there. So a man's involvement in this should not be ever discounted. They are also affected in every abortion that is done. And I give two more examples. One time we were trying to minister to a Home Depot worker, a young woman, and her boyfriend wanted her to abort. So we tried to meet her in the parking lot of Home Depot early morning to provide her, places of shelter and other contacts to a more protective community, because she wants to keep that child. I didn't know then that you can just really have a printed paper alluding to Roe versus Wade itself, that you can basically say, no one has the right to coerce me to an abortion. No one. No one has the right to coerce me to help in an abortion. And that will be to the loss of hospitals, federal funding privileges. That will be to the detriment of licenses of any professional adult, or parents will be charged, because, believe it or not, Roe versus Wade has that no one should be coerced to an abortion, even as a minor. And this is available through Justice Info and Life Call. Those are organizations which has this information, lifecall.org. And basically, this woman could have just said, you cannot tell me that. I'm going to keep my baby. And you have no say in that. But I didn't know, so we were just trying to just gather her into a safe place, right? So when we didn't see this woman in the Home Depot parking lot, there was a police car there. And the police had two cops. They have to be partnered. And when we asked them to help if they have seen a woman waiting, and this age group and this race, one cop said, we didn't see. And when we explained to the cop, because we're trying to bring her to like a pro-life shelter, she wants to keep her baby, the other cop erupted. Who cares? So what if she wants to abort her baby? It was so out of the blue. And it almost seems that he would be a possible candidate of that experience, but still not healed. Because many people, men or women, would almost like react if they have been just taken into that spirit of the world where they will be pro-abort, pro-contraceptive, pro this and that, which is opposite the direction what the Lord had said. they would be in the mindset of inviting others to the direction they have taken, which is not the good direction. It's almost like what Satan did to us, or is doing to us in general. He made the bad decision, and he's like damned and already knows it, and that's why he wants to just drag as many people as he wants and he can, just through subterfuge, through deceit, through doing what he did to Eve, which is basically, rejecting the trust and provision on the Lord's goodness. So this man is like really behaving like the trauma-centered patient, like really like very highly strong, very easily enraged, and that can easily move, especially if one is a guy, to physical kind of abuse. So this is what happened to my other friend of a friend. They were happily married until the woman, on the advice of a nurse who is pro-abort, basically she said, "Oh, your husband is a drunkard. Oh, your kid will be deformed and he will have, fetal alcohol syndrome." That was obviously wrong because that's the man drinking, not the woman. But this nurse planted this bad seed in my friend's head, and she went for an abortion because another friend advised her, go for it. Just like that. No context of what is holy, what is right. They just, she went for an abortion without telling her husband. And the moment that she basically got to share that she did abort the baby because he was drinking, the man started drinking worse. The man started abusing her, which was never the case. It was never a hurting and a violent relationship, but the trauma in that man hit him hard and it destroyed their marriage. And so what I'm saying is that post-abortion syndrome affects everybody who is involved in abortion directly, the woman or her mate. And I will describe some cases where even the family has been put into this very sensitive situation. I was giving a lecture in a church group, and one man later said, but she had all the rights. She could not really take care of this child. This man was a practicing Catholic. And yet, he had adopted the mindset of his sister out of love for her. She had that abortion, perhaps out of fear or inexperience or lack of confidence, which is really 90% of how abortion is done. It's not really the physical health of the mom. The nature of the game was that any kind of health, mental health, financial health, emotional health, social health, is now used for justification of abortion, which is never really justified, even medically. So what had happened to this man and his mom was now they were shielding the daughter or the sister from the decision that she had made. They are very much hurting, even though they don't frame it that way, because they lost their grandchild and their nephew respectively. And they know that their sister or daughter is in mortal danger. But they have just become, as I said, almost really driven to a very defensive and callous mode, refusing to acknowledge now that, well, there could be other ways to go about it. But they don't have to also agree to the direction that their daughter took. Now, I give an equivalent uh, example. This was given as examples to parents whose children are LGBT and want to do same sex marriage. They can basically say to the child, I love you, but what you're doing is wrong. I will not agree to you marrying your partner. I will not attend to your wedding because it is not really a real marriage. My attendance will possibly validate something that I really know is not really valid. So I would rather not attend out of respect and obedience and also love of the Lord that I follow. That's the decision that was offered as a better or even best alternative to parents whose kid want to do a same-sex marriage. I cannot participate out of my own moral convictions. So in the same way, this male friend of mine could use something of that boundary setting. What my sister did was wrong. We atone for it. We pray for her all the time. We pray that she realized that, it was really a beloved thing to have just taken that pregnancy in trust. Many of my friends found themselves in situations too where they were pregnant out of wedlock. And they could do, of course, one of two things. Those who have said to the Lord, and this is a direct quote, Lord, it's your child. You better take care of it. Okay, ended up with such a happy family life. They were not married, but the Lord, ultimately gave them a spouse who would love them, and their child, who is now an adult, would provide her with, grandchildren, and such like a happy kind of next generational example. It's really just fulfillment, of those who walk in the Lord, will see the blessing up to the fourth generation. Those who stay in the scenario of defending a wrong will find themselves similar to what I encounter, or you guys can even see for yourself, those in forensic files, those people who still cling on to the wrong way of life, even years after the fact, have never grown, have stayed in the dark, and perhaps stayed worse in grave and abject misery that will continue on even after their life on earth ends. So this is why we give these talks and presentations. Next slide, please. It's basically to just offer them the reminder that every soul, every child has within itself a plan, and that plan is a beautiful plan, whether we're wanted or not wanted. And this is like a pandemic picture of a baby being baptized. Churches are closed, but they have to get that going. I even baptized a kid too before the pandemic. Anyway, emergency. But this is an example that the soul is the most treasured thing we have. And whether we give that soul the nourishment and the feeding and the education that is at par or even more than what we do our bodies, that's really our task. We will be judged on how well have we known the Lord. Because to have known Him is also, I pray, to have loved Him, to have served Him, to have glorified Him. So we will be asked on how we have had faith. It is that faith which we will later translate to love. Not just love of God, which is wonderful and is the beginning of all love. That love for God brings us to love ourselves, making holy decisions, happy decisions, same thing, which also will make us to be a vessel and really a fountain of love to others. So this picture just reminds us that everyone who has a love for the Lord has a lesser chance to make poorer decisions on their own, for their own bodies, for their own unborn children, for their own living children or friends. It is really the case that a sacramental life, begins the life of a soul. Many people come to a church I go to, St. Lucy, because they fulfill their community service. They would be in jail otherwise. But they enter the church really clueless, just walking past the altar, no sense of reverence to the holy objects around him, no sense of wonder, to just the spiritual life that is in them. And so many people are Catholics, but they're pro-contraception, pro-movements that are not really life-giving. And you can see them that they're like getting mixed also in good causes, but they're ultimately not really for the totality of good. So I just invite the others to consider this as something very pro-baby, pro-life, pro-soul, pro-family, pro-marriage, and pro-church. We have to really build the church and be that salt and light. Because we are the church. All the baptized are the church. As well as, Christ lives in the Word, Christ lives in the priest, and Christ lives in the Eucharist and is the Eucharist. So I will just continue with the rest of the cases tomorrow. And this is, as you know, a very rich and complex topic. And I will just thank the Lord for the good that He has done to me to change my heart from that of a angry pro-choicer, pro-abort champion, to one who is in love with Him and in love with others. So thank you very much in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.